worst piece of conventional wisdom I ever heard was to stay away from the culture war. And this was back in 2008. The nature of the culture war in America is essentially that Republicans want to maintain a state of normalcy against radical progressive goals to reach their own version of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Progressives play the role of pushing society beyond where it's at, and they tend to win when they have a compelling vision for the future. But they get annihilated, that progressives that is, when their goals are viewed as destructive to the American way of life. The Democrats' cultural agenda only works when they are able to cast Republicans as being outdated or mean-spirited. But even on some of these issues, they had to rely on judicial rulings for gay marriage, not political support from the American people. But ultimately, an abandonment by the politicians elected to represent them. The establishment GOP's unilateral truce against the Democrats' culture war led to a slaughter. In just a few years after gay marriage, we saw the rise of men and women's sports, men and women's prisons, showers, and locker rooms. We saw children being put on cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers that were deemed even too inhumane for convicted sex offenders. Ultimately, this retreat led to one very good thing: the election of President Donald Trump. President Trump reformed the Republican Party away from being a party that represented soulless corporate CEOs to one that represents working families of all backgrounds. And he was able to do this by doing one simple thing: listening to the American people. Poll after poll has shown broad backlash against the Democrats' progressive culture war, and voters rewarded Trump for that in the 2024 election. The biggest issue for swing voters wasn't the economy or crime, while those were near the top, but it was the fact that voters felt that Kamala cared more about culture war issues like transgenderism than people like them. Brent Buchanan is the president and founder of Signal. He's one of the pollsters who saw through the idiocy of the GOP establishment's conventional wisdom to avoid the obvious opportunity to win elections using the Democrats' culture war against them. And he joins us today. Brent, welcome to the Terry Schilling Show.
Great to be here, Terry.
So let's just get into this. The hottest thing I think that people really want to talk about still, that we're still unpacking, is the 2024 election. So from your perspective, what happened? Why did Trump win?
Well, I think a lot of it was economic to start. You know, people were being pressured by the cost of living. The voter groups that you were talking about, working class folks, especially non-white working class folks, their eyes got opened up to, maybe I could vote for Trump, maybe I could vote Republican. But what I really think pushed it over the edge was these culture war issues. Because if you look at white Democrats and their ideology, they are much, much more liberal than non-white Democrats are. They tend to be more moderate, even somewhat conservative. And so as the Democrats just marched further and further and further left, what happened is these non-white Democrats, working class folks, looked around and said, okay, maybe I'm not a Democrat. Maybe I'm not a Republican yet, but I don't think I'm definitely not a Democrat anymore. And it was over these cultural issues. And I don't think it was per se the fact that they looked and said, okay, well, I've thought a lot about transgendered ideology and I'm pushing back against that. It almost represented a proxy in a way of how radical the Democrats had gotten, and that they continue to this day say, oh, Trump's on the 70% side of an issue. Let me go run to the 30% side of an issue. And he is just living rent-free in their heads, pushing them into these 20, 30, 40% topics. But that, I really believe it was a transition, no pun intended, from the economy into the culture wars, because why would the Trump campaign have closed on that message if it wasn't what was actually moving these non-white new working class voters into his camp?
Well, the after-action reports that analyzed how much money was spent on these issues on campaign ads showed that there was over $200 million spent attacking Democrats on issues like transgenderism. I'm wondering, though, from your standpoint as a pollster, you know, Democrats are locked in here. It seems like they can't get rid of this issue. They can't back away. They can't moderate. What do you think is driving that? Are they seeing polling numbers that you and I aren't seeing?
No, they live in a totally different world than we do. I mean, we're here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, sitting in Washington, D.C. on the Hill right now. And the people who live in this area, the people who live on the coast, the people who live in the big cities, mainly white folks, are so radically progressive that they cannot fathom that anybody else believes anything different than they do. And they live in their bubbles so close, they don't realize that all of America is not a bunch of radical progressives.
So you're basically saying that they're so ideologically captured here in DC that they really just can't open their minds up to being on the losing side of an issue.
Well, if you look at take ideology from progressive to liberal to moderate to conservative to very conservative. There is a huge correlation between religious attendance and ideology. And so to the progressives, to the liberals, their politics, their ideology is their religion. We all worship something.
Yes.
And that is, they don't have a God. Politics and ideology is their God, and it really locks them in that I don't even know what polling data they would look at that would back up what they believe unless they only polled themselves.
There's an interesting op-ed out this month. I believe it was in Axios or Politico. You'll have to forgive me. But someone had done the polling on this. Essentially what they're arguing, what they're telling Democrat politicians is to retreat essentially from the culture wars, stop talking about men and girls sports, instead punt and say that, this is a divisive issue. You don't want men and girls sports, but that politicians aren't really the people that should be making these decisions, that it should really be these unelected committees. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's going to work with them, or what are voters actually going to hear when they hear this stuff from Democrats?
No, I don't think they're going to hear that at all. And it's why Democrats' image has been cratering. I never thought that I would be working in politics for a party that's more popular than the Democrats, because being a Republican was not cool 20 years ago when I got in this. Nobody at my college was a Republican,
right?
And you just look at how much culture has really changed, and people will say that politics is downstream from culture, but I think because politics is so pervasive in our lives now, culture is actually downstream from politics, and we're seeing that right now in the fact that you don't have to run into a rainbow shop at Target for Pride Month. Well, first off, why the heck did they get a whole month? And why are we celebrating? I don't walk around with who I am sexually, but it's also like you see culture changing because politics was driving it. And 5-10 years ago, that was not the case.
That's so, I swear I did not pay Brent to say this. This is something that he said organically. This is something that we've been talking about at APP for years, and we've been beating it. It's because of our unique founding as a country. Politics has been central to American culture since the beginning, right? The whole notion of America's founding was that everyday people can vote. Everyday people get to participate in what we call self-government.
So long as you own land.
As long as you own land. And we moderated, we expanded that down the road. But still at the heart of it was politics. We are a political nation. We were founded on politics. But for some reason or another, they adopted this truism that's half true, right? Obviously, the information we consume and how it's consumed, like through the news media and social media, that impacts how we vote and how we think. But also when you cast your vote, when you elect someone based on a set of issues, or when you change the law, that has an impact on culture too. And that's, I have a hard time arguing against the fact that politics obviously impacts how culture goes.
Yeah, as opposed to it used to be the other way around.
Yeah. Well, we're heading into the midterms. Can we pull up image B, please? And I'll edit this. So looking ahead to the midterms, Brent, let's start with the more interesting angle. Let's say you had to advise Democrats. What are you telling them to do in order to take advantage of the 26 midterms and to take back one or two houses of Congress?
Quit making it all about Donald Trump. That if I'm advising them, and this is how we look at strategy in general, as when we're conducting a poll, when we're advising our clients, I always put myself in the spot that if I were on the other side reading this data, how would I interpret this data and what would I do? And we use that as part of how we proceed forward in advising our clients. So, I would say don't obsess over Donald Trump. His image has improved. He's in a significantly better spot in his image than he was at this exact same point, beginning of June 2017. And Republicans are in a better spot. The generic ballot is tied, and that's really good news for a Republican under a Donald Trump second term. It was bloodbath numbers at this point 8 years ago.
That's right.
In Donald Trump's term. So, I would say get over making everything about Donald Trump. Don't run that the sky is falling. That's one thing that Democrats have a tendency to do, is that they hyperbolize everything now. And so it makes them less and less believable in the message that they're saying because, you know, when they adopted the phrase threats to democracy, which was simply a dog whistle for Donald Trump, and pretended that they were the defenders of democracy who, you know, were essentially dismantling how elections should be done properly in order to protect the democracy. You know, we got to destroy democracy to protect democracy, or something ridiculous. Is that hyperbole really is hurting them. And I think right now Republicans have gotten a lot better at not being so dramatic and drastic and not reacting to the Democrats as much either, letting them stew in their own mess.
Well, I think that that's right. I think that we've litigated the Trump question, right? At least the American people have. They had a sense of, you know, replacing him, and then they had some buyer's remorse about replacing him, and they went with him again in 24. So, and I think voters view him as, you know, he can't run for re-election again. I think they want people to. I think they want their members of Congress and senators to get to work.
Yeah.
And you know, there's two recent modern elections where the incumbent presidential party maintained control of both houses. 1998, when I think voters perceived Republican attacks over Monica Lewinsky as overreach, trying to impeach Clinton over that. But then also the more interesting one is 2002, when voters perceived Democrats as being obstructionists to President Bush's, George W. Bush's agenda. In 2002, we maintain control there. So what would your advice be to Republicans who want to maintain control of Congress and not have to deal with impeachment nonstop again?
Well, it's really no different than anything I would say in a tight election, whether it's for Congress or for state legislatures. You got to build your own brand of who you are as the member or the candidate, and you can't get too locked into what the national brand is. You know, Don Bacon, you know, love him or hate him, his brand that he's been able to build in Omaha has withstood, you know, D+ a lot in that district, yet he tends to turn around and win it by a few points. And that's because of who he's built himself as a brand, which does mean sometimes pushing back against your party. I think actually what Republicans need to do is further embrace what Donald Trump is doing, and specifically around what does it mean for working class voters. And I see the culture wars as a great way to continue to go into especially Hispanic areas and some black areas around the country. And, you know, we do weekly polling nationally, large sample sizes. We model it down to tons of different congressional districts and states to see what's happening. And what we've seen in just the last 2 weeks is a huge shift for Republicans in Hispanic district areas. Now, it's not to the levels of 24 yet, but I wouldn't expect it because there's a different turnout between a midterm and a presidential election. And so there's a score of these Donald Trump voters who are not going to show up because Donald Trump's not on the ballot, or they're not going to show up because they just don't vote in midterms. But the fact that we're performing the way we are right now in, I would say, probably the roughest part of what's going to be Donald Trump's presidency, and that's a very chaotic beginning, which is on purpose. It's a lot of change all at once. If we're doing this well now, especially among these groups, we've got to lean further into that moving forward.
The one thing I want to get into is Gen Z, and there's an interesting divide coming up with Gen Z voters. And we were talking a little bit before the show, and I want to extrapolate what you were talking about earlier. Can we pull up image C, please? So essentially in Politico, they've uncovered that even within Gen Z, there is a major divide between the younger generation Gen Z versus the older. The 18 to 21, they favor Trump by 12 points. 22 to 29, they favor Democrats by 6 points. What's going on, Gen Z? This is a very complicated generation. And in talking to you, it seems like there's a gender divide too.
There is, and I don't think it's actually that good for Republicans among Gen Z. It's a really, really difficult group of voters to survey. They're the most diverse generation. They're the least connected to the normal ways of communicating, texting and calling. You know, they use everything else. So they're a really hard group to poll in the first place. I don't think Republicans are doing as well with Gen Z as some of these that would show that, you know, we're within even 10 points of Democrats in that group. But your point is still true in the fact that the post-COVID Gen Z is very different politically than the pre-COVID Gen Z. And I really think that what Democrats did going about shutting down the country and shutting down schools and telling them you can't even go play in a playground or you're going to get arrested, that had a very marked effect on the way people of that generation would normally not even care about what government thinks or does or says, realizing that it totally messed up their lives. And so you do have that age break. I think what's the scarier story is the gender break between this. So listen to some of these numbers here. So in the 24 presidential election, according to the exit poll that we did for y'all, Harris won voters under the age of 30, which of course does include some beyond Gen Z, by 23 points. Harris wins them by 23 points. Harris only won men under 30 by 10, but won women under 30 by 35 points. When you look at where they are now on the generic ballot, Gen Z females are Democrat plus 52.
Holy cow.
Men, Democrat only plus 18. So we've got room for improvement in both. It's, what this group looked like at the very beginning of Trump's presidency is different now. A lot of the groups that had put President Trump over the finish line, including Gen Z, have come off of him. It has improved in the last couple of weeks, but as a whole, if you look at the whole first 130 days or however many that we've been so far, it's not as good. But there's this massive gap. Look at this on deport. Should we deport people who are here illegally? Send them back to their country. It was 47-47 support or oppose the deportation among those under the age of 30. Men under the age of 30, plus 20 deport. Women under the age of 30, 17 let them stay. I mean, that is 37-point difference on a huge issue of our time. It's a real problem. I mean, I think I was joking earlier of like, we might not have some marriages because you're going to have a bunch of normal guys and a bunch of lefty girls. And what's going to happen to family formation because of this massive ideology? No other generation has this huge of a gender gap. The worst gender gap next is millennials. And then above that's Gen X, but now you're into like single-digit gender gap differences once you get into that generation.
That's fast because look, I think this is a major problem that needs to get solved is the lack of marriages in this country and ultimately lack of children being born. And if you dig into the numbers, it really is a lack of marriages that's causing the birth dearth, as we call it. So I hadn't really thought about this gender gap in terms of political ideology.
Yeah.
But that's got to be a driver. I mean, if I'm not going to marry someone that is a radical progressive, it's not, you may have married someone in the 80s who was a Democrat if you were a Republican and vice versa.
The gap between the two was
so
much
small
smaller back then.
Yeah, it wasn't about transitioning children or not giving kids sex changes. It was, I want abortion legal for, the first 20 weeks of pregnancy versus not at all, right? It's a much smaller gap. How do you fix that?
I mean, it's all happening in the schools and mostly in the universities, because if you look at, let's say 65 plus voters, they're about the same number of college graduates by gender, maybe a little bit more male, especially when you go into the older generation, the older aspect of that generation. But the number of people going into school and finishing their 4 years that are female is much higher than males now. And so it's one key thing that you can point to and say that the universities are radicalizing women more than they are men. And very few men are walking into a relationship nowadays and saying, are you a Republican or a Democrat? There are plenty of women walking into relationships saying, if you're a Republican, this is just not going to work. And it's sad, but it is, I blame the schools. I actually blame Republicans in general for the last 50 years because we've ceded control of every institution. We're even giving up on the institution of church now, as people on the right. And I think that was a huge mistake. We just assumed they were bureaucracies or institutions that would continue, like the media, the courts. I mean, just you could continue to name institutions that we gave up on. And the left said, let's go weaponize those for our purposes.
They took them all over.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you get back to like the opening thing that I was talking about avoiding the culture war. I mean, Republicans they avoided talking about these pivotal issues that were really going to determine, I think the economy is downstream of the culture, right? If you have bad people that lie, steal, and cheat, that think that giving kids gender transitions is totally moral, what type of economy are you going to get? Yeah. Right? Are those people that are going to work hard or work honestly? I I don't know. I don't think it's very honest to make money off of sterilizing children.
Billion-dollar industry.
It's billions and billions. It's $4.5 billion. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. I don't know how we get out of it.
In universities, maybe.
Yeah, well, look, the Trump administration is doing a lot to rein in. Look, I saw an interview a few weeks ago of someone that was talking about the higher ed, and she said that Harvard is actually a hedge fund. It's not a university. It masquerades as a university, but really it's a $50 billion hedge fund. And that is what determines, they use the university to hide that fact and to protect their hedge fund status. But, if you look at these universities, especially these Ivy Leagues, they are billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars of a hedge fund, essentially. It's so corrupt. And meanwhile, they're strapping all these kids with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. It's probably the most immoral thing ever. Anyway, you're a pollster. I want to let's talk about the direction of the country and Donald Trump's approval rating. Can you unpack that? Because what I've been seeing recently, even on CNN, they've been talking about Donald Trump, how he started to crater in his approval rating early in the administration, and now it looks like it's coming back. What are you seeing from your polling, and what's interesting there? What do you think's driving it?
What's really interesting is if you go back to the Biden administration and you look at polling of direction of the country, approval of the economy, and Joe Biden's image, they moved basically in tandem. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating is that the second Donald Trump was inaugurated, the mood of the country improved. And, it's still upside down. There's still more people believe we're headed in the wrong track than in the right direction. And what's been fascinating is it's been incredibly durable. Our number in February is almost identical to our numbers in May, and we're going in the field today for our June survey. And I expect direction of the country to be right around the exact same, 52-47 number. But Trump has a lot more strength to his image. So I was going back and I pulled up a Quinnipiac University poll from the end of May 2017. Donald Trump's image was upside down by 18 points. Fast forward 8 years to the same exact days in his second administration, and we have him only down by 2 points on his image.
Which is interesting because, you kind of expect when someone gets in power that they're going to start to lose a little bit of support. Yeah. The honeymoon period gets over, but this guy's done a ton of stuff. Like, he's taken a lot of action, and usually when you take a lot of actions, your approval gets a little bit hit.
Yeah.
But that's
he's improved 2 points in his net image from the beginning of May to the end of May, because we poll every week now. And when you look at voters under the age of 35, at the beginning of May, he was upside down by 34 points with them, and now he's only upside down by 21 points among this group. Seniors, the group or audience we were talking about, they went from a +1 to -5. So they've actually had a 6-point degradation in Trump's image.
What do you think is driving that?
I think it's the pace of change still, and I think it's the
old timers don't like when things move too quickly.
They don't. I mean, my grandfather's 93, about to be 93, rip red conservative, but he just doesn't like Donald Trump, and it's how he conducts himself. He's tearing apart things that have existed for their entire lifetimes that benefited them. Those generations really benefited from the housing prices increasing, and the economy worked for folks who are boomers and older. The economy doesn't work for folks, maybe some Gen X, but not millennials and not Gen Z, which is why I think you're seeing a lot of discontent in that generation. But independents, he's improved his image from -25 to -19. He's even among Republicans added 4 more points to his favorability in just May. We're just talking about beginning of May to end of May. And so I would expect that we begin to see a continued improvement in his image. I mean, I can see where his image gets tied or he actually gets net favorable, which would be fascinating to see a net favorable Donald Trump image come late summer when a lot of these economic things that they're doing start to really take root and show up in people's pocketbooks.
Before the show, we had a meeting at the White House, and it was interesting because they asked us, it always comes up, what more can we be doing? Like, what haven't we checked off the list that you guys are hoping to get accomplished? And I was I knew what they were going to, ask, and we had like a small list, but I told him, I'm like, I feel like the dog that caught the car. Like, we got all of this stuff done within the first 5 months, and we were planning a traditional administration where it takes years and years and years just to get the most basic things done. But it seems like voters are kind of rewarding him for actually getting stuff over the finish line rather than taking his time.
Well, even if they don't necessarily like what he's doing, it's nice to see that your government's actually doing something. You know, in the Biden administration, you didn't get to see that. And I would say in Trump's first administration, it lost some of its mojo towards the end. And, you know, I actually thank God that Joe Biden stole that election, because I don't think Trump would have been able to do then, having just finished up his second term, what he's doing now. Because he got to see it all, see what was wrong with it. Then they all got to plot for 4 years of what they were going to do to come in, which is how they were able to do so much in the first 100 days. They would not have had that opportunity going into a lame duck second term, coming out of the first term, coming out of COVID, coming out of, you know, I think the pivot of this country is much stronger because Donald Trump won non-consecutive terms as opposed to consecutive terms.
You're not the only person that said that to me. Is that the biggest curse that Democrats had was rigging the last election.
Yeah.
It gave Trump 4 years. And by the way, not just 4 years to really plot and plan and analyze his first term, what went right, what went wrong, who was loyal, who wasn't, who was effective and who wasn't. But it gave him motivation. I mean, I don't think that he's as motivated if Democrats aren't trying to bankrupt him, if they aren't trying to throw him in prison, if they aren't going after his family members, right? Like, that type of stuff, like any prideful man is going to be very motivated to at least get revenge by being extremely successful as quickly as possible.
Yep, agreed.
Well, one thing that I've noticed that I wanted to pick your brain about is CNN's run this segment several times on transgender issues, where they show their polling. It's usually around 2021, 2022 on transgender issues like men and women's sports and whether or not they should be banned. And there was an interesting segment that they ran on the day that Trump signed his executive order on women's sports, which is they showed a 17-point increase. You know, before the election in 2021, the percentage of Americans that wanted to ban biological men from women's sports was 61% to 30. Well, now when Trump signed it as an executive order, it went to 78 to 19. So it looks like these issues are actually getting stronger after he's taking action. I've kind of attributed that to the fact that Donald Trump has made it more real. He's brought it front and center. When we were first working on this issue, voters didn't think it was happening. They thought it was so crazy that they didn't think it was actually happening. My gut has been that now they see it's happening. They see men like Leah Thomas or William Thomas winning championships against Riley Gaines on everywhere. It's not just that case.
Well, that was
anymore.
the only example back then.
Right.
And now I was flipping through my X feed earlier today, and I saw 3 different instances of a dude standing at the top of a podium just from the last 1 to 2 weeks of women's sports, girls sports.
Yes.
And I agree with you. I think it was so unbelievable that folks were like, yeah, that's pretty stupid, but it's not a threat. It's like, it's not actually happening in a lot of places. In the exit poll that we did for y'all after the 24 election, we asked if people had seen any advertising on a couple things: trans surgeries for prisoners, men and women's sports, or where Democrats were pushing for gender transition, sex changes for minors, and trying to figure out what impact did that have on voters. And so 57% of folks recall seeing the trans surgery for prisoners ad. 59% of those who saw one of those 3 ads or more were more likely to vote for the Republican candidate for Congress. 62% of people under the age of 55 saw those ads, which is wild that you would have a generation that is harder to reach in advertising be much more likely to recall seeing one or more of those ad topics than older generations who consume immense amounts of advertising. The men and women's sports issue was the number one motivator to move black voters to Donald Trump.
Interesting.
The gender transition surgery for kids or for prisoners moved Hispanics the most.
Wow.
We looked, because in this poll for you, we actually had 6% of folks who said they voted for Biden in 20, vote for Trump in 24. More than 7 in 10 recall seeing the ads. I mean, I'm not going to say that's causation, but it is one heck of a correlation to see that almost 80% of people who flipped from Biden to Trump recall seeing these ads. Don't tell me the culture wars aren't what we need to be running on.
Well, so I'll just tell you, we work with Jeremy Peters at the failing New York Times, and they always do a profile on APP's work on the trans issue after every major election. And I remember they only gave us a few lines of our post-election autopsy for what happened in 2024. And I was disappointed because usually we're getting everything. But then I realized, oh, they're not using APP's numbers because they were relying on the Democrats' numbers, which actually showed it even being even more impactful, which, by the way, your polls show that the trans issue shifted 2.7% of the electorate towards Trump away from Biden, which is an enormous amount of swing in a presidential election. But yeah, no, the Democrats' after action numbers showed that the Kamala's for they, them, Donald Trump's for you ad was seen by more people, more times, and it shifted more votes than any other demographic. It was the most cited ad that anyone had seen in their focus groups. And one thing I'll share with you, just because I think it's interesting, we just did some focus groups in Arlington, which is incredibly democratic. We actually
I live in the People's Republic of Arlington. Thank you.
But we couldn't actually find very many moderate or independent voters there. And so we sat down with left-wing voters. They were using lines, Democrats were using lines that I could have written for them as a conservative on the women's sports issue. Oh, I think this is, I support acceptance and tolerance for transgender individuals. We need to support them, but this is just a matter of fairness when it comes to sports. Or on the gender transitions for minors. Oh, well, we don't let kids get tattoos even before they're 18. We should let them have some time before they can get. I mean, it's just incredible how much of an impact a successful presidential candidate can have on the culture.
Completely. Well, and I think it's going to have an impact in 26 because you guys do a poll in Georgia.
Yes.
John Ossoff,
yes,
running for re-election. We asked, would you vote for the generic Republican or the generic Democrat for Senate? Republican ahead by 46-45. Ossoff tied a just generic Republican. We didn't even give a name at 44-44. And then we introduced one piece of information. And it was a single line about John Ossoff voting against getting men out of women's sports. Turns just that one piece of information, flips the race to Republican plus 14. And John Ossoff falls to 38%.
38%?
One piece of information.
So anytime you're under 50 is a disaster as an incumbent.
Yep.
But to go under 40, that's a nightmare.
You don't see it. You don't see it. Maybe if you introduce 15 negative messages on the Democrat and 10 positive messages on the Republican, maybe you could get the Democrat in a normal survey to 43, 42. But to get under 40 is outrageous. But I think it shows the potency of the issue.
So whoever the challenger is against John Ossoff, they need to make this issue front and center.
Yeah, and I would hope that the outside groups on our side of the aisle are go ahead and start hammering him on it. Get him on the defense on this issue.
All right. So we've talked a lot about 2024. We've talked a lot about the midterms. Imagine Donald Trump's watching this right now. What's your advice? We've talked about what you would tell generic Republicans to do to keep control of Congress. What would you advise President Trump to do?
It's a good question. We're going to have to show some economic and cost of living progress. Just as I had mentioned at the beginning of this, where the poor economy and the high cost of living got some Democrat voters to at least put their head up and say, oh, there's another party. Let me consider them. It's the same thing now. We've got to show economic and noticeable in their pocketbook at the grocery store economic progress. And then we've got to continue casting Democrats as holding radical positions on things like immigration, on the trans issue, on these others. And we've got to use those cultural issues as the proxies for how dangerous their views are and how outside of the mainstream that they are. I don't think we've got to set up anything as Republicans and say, we're going to do A, B, C, and D, and E, and F, and G, and X, Y, Z.
Yes.
If you keep us here. I think it's simply, we're going to protect you against that. Mm-hmm. Because we do a lot of work in our line, not just looking at surveys, but actually looking at academic studies, looking at other sciences, behavioral sciences, social sciences, to figure out what makes people tick. And then how do we use that in our craft? And people are way more likely to take an action to protect themselves against losing something or against a bad consequence than they are to achieve a good outcome. So what they're willing to do to not lose $100 is much stronger than if they could win or earn $100. And so I don't necessarily believe that in this instance, when we're the party in power, that we've got to cast this vision of we're going to do all these other things. It's more the Democrats are so far out here, and you electing us will protect you from these crazy things that they want to do. And that's a stronger message.
They really do want to do crazy things.
And they do. We don't have to make it up. That's they make up stuff about us, like on abortion. You know, they'll take something that's said and totally throw it out and be like, your raped 13-year-old daughter is going to die because you voted for this Republican congressman. Just complete hyperbole. We don't have to make up anything. We just use their own words against them, like in the they them ad. Like that was what made that ad so powerful against Kamala Harris. It was her sitting on a stage cackling. Thank God we don't have to hear that for 4 years. And we didn't make up what she said. It was her own words saying this radical thing.
No, that's exactly right. We have them on camera, and I do think that they are in a tough spot, because for the last 10 years they felt like the wind was at their back in the culture war, primarily because Republicans were refusing to attack them in the culture war up until now, and so they spent a lot of time ginning up hysteria, telling the LGBT movement that Republicans wanted to kill them if they didn't want to put men and girls sports, just like really radical things. And so now they're in a damned if they do, damned if they don't position where if they moderate on the trans issue by kicking boys out of girls sports, well, then they're going to lose their base, because they told their base for years that lives were at stake, that this was completely unacceptable discrimination to keep boys out of girls sports. But then if they don't moderate, they're going to lose all the independents and swing voters.
Well, and somebody like a Rahm Emanuel, it appears trying to make some sort of political comeback and be involved in the 28 election, either as a candidate or a sage in some way to the Democratic Party. Nobody's paying him any attention because he's saying we got to stop being completely ridiculous and let's talk about real issues that matter to regular people. The problem is the Democratic Party was the party of the working class forever. If you didn't have a college degree 30, 40 years ago, you were probably a Democrat, almost guaranteed a Democrat. And if you had a college degree and a country club membership, you were pretty darn likely to be a Republican. And this diploma divide that existed has completely inverted. And Donald Trump didn't cause it, but Donald Trump definitely threw some gas on it and really took it outside of the white population into the non-white population. And if you're a Democratic Party where your base is crazy white liberals, and you don't have this diverse coalition as much that you had for the last 50 years to build your electoral victories on, it is going to cause you to go into loony la-la land on these multiple issues. And that's really where Democrats find themselves. And so all you have to do is go like pan a Trump rally and look and just in your mind think, what do these people look like? And then pan a Harris rally, and it's all like women in their 60s and 70s, and they all look very unhappy.
Miserable.
A third of them are wearing masks. I mean, no joke. Like walking around Arlington, I can tell who is a radical progressive versus just like a liberal or a moderate, because they just
the blue hair or the mask.
They look unhappy.
Yes.
You know, it's just like on their face.
Yes.
Now, and I don't even have to ask if somebody's conservative anymore because they just look happy.
One last thing I want to get into. Democrats are obviously struggling with men winning any type of male voters over. It looks like they've recruited this Olivia Juliana, who's,
straight out of Sports Illustrated. You know?
The opposite of that. And David Hogg, obviously. This obviously is not the right track if you want to win over men. What would you advise Democrats in order to do? Because they are in a rock and a hard place. Whereas if they start talking positively about men, they're going to get hurt with the rest of their base. Is there any out for them to win back men, or are they kind of stuck?
I think they're stuck right now because they don't have anybody who really understands them on their side of the aisle. I was reading something on the way.
Anyone that really cares about them or wants them.
Exactly. They just want them to win elections. They don't actually care about them at all. And I was reading something on the way over here, and I forget the source, but it essentially was looking at somebody's partisanship compared to their mental health. They said they had very
I've
good
seen
mental
this.
health, bad mental health. And it was like, if you had bad mental health, you were like plus 50 something percent, like margin Democratic. And if you had great mental health, you were highly likely to be a conservative Republican.
You're probably a traditional housewife and
I
a
really think
good
that
husband.
it is coming down to like mental illness
Mm-hmm.
at this point. And I mean, thank God we're not on that side of the aisle, you know?
Yeah, well, look, I hope that we can get rid of these SSRI. I do think that there's a whole system in place that's making people more mentally ill, and I do think it's making them more democratic. And so hopefully we can fix the mental health crisis.
Or maybe we just all hang out again. You remember when you would like
Yes.
just hang out with people and
Yes.
it didn't matter if you were on different sides of the political aisle? That I really, we were joking about getting rid of universities. I think the real answer is let's all just have conversations again, and we can agree to disagree. And that doesn't make us good or bad people if we're on opposite sides of the aisle. But like, social media really has segmented us out into our own little bubbles, and we only see and hear content that fits exactly our views, and we don't have the ability to like relate to other people anymore. And I put this on the right too.
Yes.
I mean, we're having this conversation somewhat tongue in cheek about mental illness. I don't mean it in a mean way at all. I mean, I take mental health very seriously.
Yes.
And I think there are people who definitely struggle with that, but we have completely lost the ability to just talk with each other.
Well, a lot of my friends were Democrats growing up, and hardly any of them want to talk anymore. And look, I'm not like a crazy right-wing culture warrior. I just simply say men shouldn't be in girls' sports. They shouldn't be in women's prisons or their locker rooms and showers. We shouldn't give porn to kids online, and we shouldn't let kids get sex change procedures. Like, that's not that radical, or at least it wasn't when I was growing up. But I've lost friends over this. They don't talk anymore. And I think the unfortunate thing is that is what makes things interesting. When there's conflict, when there's disagreement, that's how I learn, right? A lot of my friends are not Catholic. I'm Catholic, but a lot of my friends are Protestant. We have some of the most lively, interesting, and fun discussions you can possibly have. And yeah, it gets heated at times, but that's kind of what makes it fun.
Yep.
As long as you don't take it too seriously.
We'll talk about Martin Luther after this. Okay?
Oh gosh. Oh, yes, that would be great. We'll have another episode all on Martin Luther. Anyway, Brent, I wish we disagreed more on this podcast, but I'm so happy you came on. I learned a lot just from talking to you, and I'm sure that a lot of the listeners and viewers learned a lot as well. So thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to having you back on again to talk about things as we get closer to the 2026 midterms.
Hey, thank you, Terry.
Thanks.